Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. Before we start this episode, I wanted to share some exciting news. My organization, the Urban Assembly, is hosting its 7th annual Social and Emotional Learning Symposium on May 17th in New York City, and tickets are available now. This year's Social and Emotional Learning Symposium will host a diverse array of topics, such as SEL in the age of AI and social media, integrating SEL into lesson planning, and higher ed approaches to SEL, all presented through engaging panels, insightful presentations, and interactive workshops. If you want to hear expert insights on social and emotional learning from compelling speakers, while also getting the chance to network with SEL advocates from across the country that you do not want to miss, the Urban Assembly SEL Symposium. Can't wait for the symposium, and I hope to see you there. Tickets are available on our website at urbanassembly.org. Go get a ticket today. And with that out of the way, I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, I'm here with Dr. Bridget Hamre, the co-founder and chief executive officer at Teachstone. Dr. Hamre specializes in student-teacher relationships and the classroom processes that promote positive academic and social development in young children. She's authored more than 65 peer-reviewed manuscripts on these topics in the last 15 years, and your research demonstrates the ways educator-child relationships and teachers' social and instructional interactions support children's development and learning, and may help close the opportunity gap for students at risk of school failure. Dr. Hamre, you're the co-author of the Classroom Assessment Scoring System and led early work to scale the use of class as an assessment and professional development tool across the country. You collaborate with the Office of Head Start on their implementation of the class, and you have consulted with numerous states on the quality, rating, and improvement systems. Bridget, we are very, very excited to have you on our show here. Welcome to Innovations in Education with David Adams.
Oh my gosh, it's a pleasure to be here. And now that we have all that boring stuff over, we get to do the fun stuff and have a conversation.
Well, Bridget, real excited to have you here because throughout our career, my career, to be specific, every time I've sat with you, I've walked away with a new insight or a new way of thinking about teaching and learning. And you spend your whole career really thinking about what teaching and learning is and how to really communicate that effectively to practitioners and researchers in a way that they could actually use it. So I'm going to ask you to summarize your research in one sentence. It's 65 papers, hundreds of book chapters, hundreds of conversations. But if I had to get you to talk about this in one sentence, what would it be?
Oh, gosh, one sentence. Okay. Interactions amongst humans are the core ingredient of thriving.
Okay. Let's take a minute with this. The
Yeah.
interactions amongst humans are the core ingredient. Okay, so I didn't hear you talk about learning. I heard you talk about thriving.
Yeah.
I heard you use the word interactions rather than instruction.
Yeah.
Can we break this down a little bit more?
Yeah, I would love to. So actually, let's start with thriving, right? Because ultimately, we have to align our work around what we're trying to achieve. And for a long time, if you would have asked me, what are the outcomes that I'm focused on? I probably would have spit back a lot of language about things like social emotional learning and academic outcomes. And all of those things are important and a part of our work. But recently, I've loved this word thriving for a variety of reasons. Well, let me ask you, when you hear the word thriving, what does it make you think about?
When I think about the word thriving, it makes me think about not only just like surviving, as it were, but like maximizing my potential, right? So I'd be like, I'm average, on a worst day, but when I'm thriving, it's like every little thing that I could potentially achieve within my talent and my skills, I'm knocking it out of the park.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, it's funny because our mission statement has something about reaching full potential, but I actually like thriving even more because not only does it have that, which is true, but there's also this way in which humans can define it for themselves. So yes, the educational system needs to be targeted in supporting the skills that we know are going to help people exist and do well in the world. but that can look pretty different. So I think this word thriving, we have this new training where we start out having people sort of give their definitions of thriving. And I think it's a nice place to start. The other word I was really intentional about a couple of them, right? One was this word interactions.
Hmm.
Again, for a long time, if you asked me about what our core work was, I would have said it was a study of teaching, right? Because teaching is a word that people know and understand. It is essentially what we were doing. We were spending thousands of hours watching teachers in classrooms with students. So it felt familiar. But the reality is, the core of the work that we've done, and we'll talk more about that, is this recognition that the power of humans, the power of adults, particularly in classrooms, is about their ability to interact. It's not to teach, it's not just to convey information, it's not to sort of ask the perfect question.
Mm.
It's always about what happens next. It's how much teachers sort of recognize and respond to students. So it's in that power of interaction. It's why this is a far more amusing thing to listen to, I hope, over the next few minutes than if I were just to sit and talk. It's all about the interaction.
Before you go on with that, Bridget, when you talk about interactions, you take me back to like, let's say sixth grade science, right? And you're talking about like, what is a life form? And one of the things they were like, oh, life interacts with their environment. That's like one of
Mm.
the constituencies of what it means
Yeah.
to be alive. And so when you talk about thriving, adapt to the environment, and like this idea of interacting with themselves in the environment, I feel like we're getting down to some basic level understandings of what it means to be human. And I'm refining that or contrasting that to like more static teaching and learning processes, like open-ended questions.
Yeah, because it really is so dynamic. Anytime a teacher throws out a question, the reaction and the response, just like it would be at a cellular level, is going to be entirely different depending on what day it is, what the mood is, what students are in there. She could ask that same question 10 minutes later and she could get a very different response. So the magic of interactions
Mm,
it is educators who recognize there's no perfect question. It is what happens next and how ready they are to support the students on whatever path they're trying to take them on.
mm. I want to sit with that a little bit because you said there's no perfect question. We sit around, I know on urban assembly, we spend a lot of time thinking about like quality of questions, right? What I heard you say is like each question could be responded to differently in a context, right? Good day, bad day, left side of the room, right side of the room. But it's the responsiveness of the teacher, their ability to take in that information and to extend those interactions that I'm hearing you kind of like put your $5, $25, this is the bet that we're making.
Yeah, and it's so hard, right? We want educators to be able to prepare, right? So being prepared with thinking about what the right questions are is important because it helps you feel, but the true professional, something that takes, a really long time in your career to get to is recognizing that that's just the beginning. And I would just point out it's a reason why I said sort of human interactions, because as much as we'll probably focus a lot on teacher student, teacher child interactions today, ultimately educators learn through interactions as well. And so sometimes we put a lot of focus on what they're doing in the classroom without recognizing that they often don't have the supports and interactions around them to help them thrive.
Well, let's get into the classroom assessment scoring system. So, do you spend really your career cataloging these first, we might say, teaching and learning processes, and now we might say quality interactions that drive student learning? What is the class? How does it work? What's the research behind it? How was it developed? Help our audience really think about what this tool is and how it speaks to your vision of human interactions and thriving.
So, at its core, class is really about a system that allows us to focus on, measure, and ultimately improve the kinds of interactions we've been talking about. But I'll go sort of way back to its genesis, which started on the measurement front. So, back, I was a PhD student at the University of Virginia with Dr. Pianta. And at that time, there was a longitudinal study going on that was following children from birth through, they ended up following them through adolescence. And there was a fundamental conversation happening about how to measure their experiences in settings that would explain whether they were thriving or not, ultimately, whether they were having positive outcomes socially, emotionally, academically, et cetera. And all of the available observational tools at the time really focused on counting behaviors, counting things in the environment. And so a fundamental innovation of Dr. Pianta, but also lots of the folks doing that early work was to say, we know from developmental science that it's about interactions. So the
Mm,
question then is, how do you measure those? So we really spent, a decade experimenting with reviewing the research from child development, from education, and then playing around with, even if you know these things are important, how do you actually measure them in classrooms? That was the sort of first work. And as it's evolved, once we got good at measuring things that were happening in classrooms that mattered to students and their outcomes, then we turned to the next and most important task, which is, well, how do we support educators to be able to improve those?
Okay.
So that's the core work. I can say a lot more, but you ask questions where you'd like to dig in more.
Well, since you spent 10 years getting some sense of clarity, tell me what are some key indicators that predict thriving and how do you measure them using the class?
So we talk about three broad domains that we measure. And the scientific, like the word that's in the measure for those, is emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. I like to talk about them as connect, engage, and inspire learning because those words make more sense to people. One thing that I will say that is different about class as compared to lots of observational measures is we are not measuring the quality of math instruction per se or literacy instruction per se, because we need to develop an observational tool that could be used in any classroom, anytime, no matter what was happening. So we really are focused on some of the core interactions, but also teaching moves that are happening every day in every single classroom. Emotional support really pays attention to the ways in which educators foster relationships,
Hmm.
both among individual students or with individual students, and then among the classroom community, how much they individualize their support. So, do they notice when that child is really struggling and provide just the right level of support they need to do better? And then, and this is one of my favorite dimensions, something we call regard for student or adolescent perspective, which is about, is the educator able to sort of follow the lead of students, give real autonomy to students, or do they have a plan and they just follow that plan?
Let's take a second because I know we have
Yeah,
other dimensions, but
yeah,
I,
yeah.
I I know a lot of teachers who are like, look, Dave, if I give students the ability to lead the class, I'm never going to hit my lesson objectives. And I know I have the regions here in New York City coming at the end of the year, and I'm going to be accountable to that. So I know that's your favorite dimension, Bridget, but it seems a little iffy with regards to how to plan a classroom around regard for student adolescent perspectives.
It's so hard. It's why the best teachers over time, they're like symphony conductors or something, right? They know how to let folks do their own thing for a little while, but then bring them back in. Funny story, when we were developing class, the secondary version, we were working with some faculty that train secondary teachers, and they hated this dimension, the exact reasons that you described. So I think it does go against what we tend to tell teachers, which is like, you need to be in control. But the reality is, and I imagine you've seen this in your schools, once we get over our own fear of letting kids have control, it flips the switch in the classroom because every student, especially teenagers, right, want to be recognized for the value that they can bring. And ultimately, teachers have a lot more power in the classroom if they're able to let go of that desire to sort of come across as the person in charge and do things the way they had planned. But I know it's hard.
We'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the relationship between teachers' social emotional skills and their ability to organize learning experiences. But let's get back to some of these other dimensions
Yeah.
and how learning experiences and interactions feed into these dimensions to drive learning outcomes.
Yeah. So the second broad domain is something we call classroom organization. It's really about the ways in which educators can sort of facilitate students' engagement and behavior and attention in ways that help them get the most out of a classroom. We always say that we actually even use these words in the class manual, that it looks like a well-oiled machine, right? Students know what to expect. They know that, there's always going to be challenges with behavior, but there's a routine for how those are handled in ways that they don't become really disruptive. And that there's just something for students to do every day. And you'd think that's like a sort of an obvious one, but from other observational studies where they really do just count sort of things that are happening, there's a lot of unused time in your typical classroom. So the idea that students have something to be engaged in, and then that teachers are able to facilitate their engagement in ways that help them make the most of that learning opportunity.
It sounds like what you're saying there is that notion, a little bit of a productivity or productive classroom, which honors student time. Ron Berger has a quote in one of his books, and he just talks about we students spend thousands and thousands of hours in the classroom, What does it take to honor that time with learning experiences that are responsive to what students care about? And so this notion of unused time and prepping and making sure students are being productive and engaged speaks to me in that way.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a teenager who, can speak endlessly about the wasted time that is very frustrating to him, right? He has a lot better things to do. And if given, if not given something productive, he will find ways of engaging that are probably
Mm,
less productive. So, and then the third domain is what we call instructional support.
okay.
And here again, we're not focused specifically on math or reading or science, but we can measure these instructional interactions across those contexts. And it's really about what are teachers doing to help students learn how to think, to help them develop sort of key concepts and ideas. And it's about the language and communication that's happening in the classroom.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
are teachers doing all the talking, or they're really supporting a dialogue among students? One of my favorite examples that I read about early on in this work was that we as a society in the United States don't often support true dialogue. Our expectation is that the teacher asks a question to one student, they respond, and it's sort of this back and forth. And frankly, most of the other students aren't even paying any attention.
Mm,
But culturally, in places like Japan, as an example, if a teacher asks a question, the whole student population is attentive to that dialogue because
mm.
there's an expectation that this is a dialogue for all of us. And it goes back to that sort of idea of the teacher as the control and linchpin. So really supporting students' thinking skills,
Mm.
providing feedback, and helping students learn how to have the deep conversations that we know really drive their learning across domains.
What I want to lift up here, Bridget, is some of this language that you're using. It's talking about instructional support. You're saying things like learn how to ensure students think, learn how to ensure students can engage in high quality dialogue and conversation, communicate key concepts. That's a little different than instruct on, let's say, procedures or information. I didn't hear translation of information to students. I heard think, dialogue, construct.
I mean, how much of what you learned when you were in high school do you retain in your brain today?
Well, I remember the processes of life, like the beginning of our conversation. I'm actually a pretty good memory,
Oh, no. That was a bad question to you.
but
Uh,
I take the point, right? How much content do I use on a given day in order to solve problems?
yeah, and I am not saying that content isn't important. It's incredibly important, but I think sometimes we bias our work in education on thinking that that is the answer, that sort of getting students to hold all of this information in their head that they can then spit back on tests is
Mhm.
ultimately the thing that's gonna help them thrive when they get to needing to have a job, and the reality is there's just a real disconnect there. So it's a little bit about prioritization. So, yes, we need time for our students just to practice basic sort of skills, but if we're only doing that and not developing the skills that help them learn how to learn, and providing them with the feedback and support that they need to push them beyond what they could just do on their own, then we're really not, to use your language earlier, maximizing the potential that they have.
I'm very resonant with that. As you know, we need to think about how our schools really develop the thinking strategies of our young people, particularly in the age of AI, right? We'll talk a little bit about that later.
Yeah.
Um, but as we think about the pedagogy and the way the interactions, and I want to spend a little second on this because you had mentioned this is grounded in developmental psychology, right? And that is like one of the key ideas in developmental psychology. It is the interactions with young people that drive their understanding of the world, brain connections, their schemas. It's not this unfolding process genetically. It's truly this genes versus nurture argument, and to extend that to the classroom, that learning is not just interactional in the way that our brain develops as children, but that in the way that we understand ourselves and the world in the classroom. I think it's a deep, deep insight that you brought to the space.
Well, I also think that it's just a reflection that, humans are human and we bring all of our humanness to everything that we do. So sometimes it feels like, when I send my kids off to school, that I'm supposed to only send a part of them. I'm supposed to only send the part that like wants to learn how to read and
Yeah.
do math and but like leave all that other stuff behind. And we give those messages to our kids. We give those messages to educators, right? One of my other favorite examples from class was we were doing work in an unnamed state very early on. And when they learned about the names of the domains, particularly the name of emotional support. They said, can we change that to social support? Because we at the Department of Education are not allowed to use the word emotion because that's owned by the Department of Social Services. I
Wow.
kid you not, right? But
Wow.
that's the idea that like emotions aren't for classrooms. But I don't know how many classrooms you've been in lately. Do you feel like emotions aren't relevant in those contexts?
Well, here at the UA, we do not put emotions first, right? We are all about producing robots for society because we know that that's like the future of work and education is emotionless beings who can only discourse about things like Shakespeare. So, which in and of itself is an emotionless category of education. So I'm with you, Bridget. Like whoever you talk to, they have some vision there that we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe in some future state we'll have more robots, but I don't think so. I think when we get to talking to AI, I actually think it's going to make all that we're talking about sort of more relevant.
Well, so we have these great dimensions, right? And there are things like emotional support, there are things like classroom organization, there are things like instructional support. And you spend years and years cataloging this. When you tell me the story, I always imagine kind of 26-year-old Bridget Hamre, like going through all this educational research and being like, here are things that matter, right? And the class has been around for a good amount of time and we have great research on it. So why is teaching practice so variable in 2024? What's been the disconnect between naming and developing throughout your career in the future?
Okay, well, I want to like put a pin in something you said about the 26-year-old Bridget. So we're going to come back to that.
Okay.
I mean, the reality is that some of what we're talking about is a pretty fundamental philosophical debate about what school is for, right? And so it's hard for, I would say, I mean, you do a lot of work in social emotional learning, which has been incredibly impactful and powerful, but I think it's pretty hard for some of these innovative ways of thinking about what school is to change within the current system,
Mhm.
which has been designed for a very different set of outcomes. And so I think, of course, there's variability because we haven't designed the systems of education around the kinds of interactions that we've been talking about. So, why should we expect anything else? And the other thing I will just say about variability is like, we should always expect variability, right? My concern is, the sort of depressing part of lots of the research is just how many students walk into classrooms every day where they feel demoralized, where no one cares about them, where they're not being challenged. That seems unacceptable. We could raise the floor and then just deal with the fun part of variability, which is how to get everyone up to excellent.
Well, let's spend 10 seconds making a connection to me, right? Because we talked about the fundamental philosophy around teaching and learning. And one of the things I think when I talk about the class that I have to really emphasize is that emotional support drives instructional outcomes. Because people are like, oh, emotional support, that's for the kids, right? So, but like, no, it's all part of one kind of construct around interactions and instructional outcomes. So, talk to me a little bit about the relationship between these three things. Because, like, classroom organization, seems separate than emotional support. Let's just train on content understanding. Like, make that connection for me so that we can understand the holistic understanding of how you think about interactions driving human thriving.
Yeah. So, first, there are lots of studies that show exactly what you're saying that emotional support, relationship development, individualization, and supporting children's autonomy drive academic outcomes. And a part of that is because the fundamental skills that develops in students, feelings of safety, a willingness to take a risk, those are the things that actually allow them to take advantage of the instructional opportunities that are afforded to them.
Mhm.
I would also say, though, this is a little wonkier, but we did a paper called the Bi-Factor paper, which sort of asked that question, which was like, what's in common across all of these dimensions that might predict positive outcomes for students? And we ended up calling that sort of global factor responsive teaching. It is about, and we've talked about some of these things, it is about things like cue detection, meaning,
Yes.
am I as a teacher noticing when a student has a social need, an emotional need, an academic need, who
Yes.
need me because they're about to have a like lose it. And so some of those things like cue detection, the ability to do the like back and forth exchange, those are sort of fundamental to this approach, which is different, as we said, than a much more transactional idea that my job is just to come in, convey information, and then you either learn it or you don't.
Well, let's get this cue detections piece up because you and I wrote a book chapter actually, and we identified one of the key social emotional skills that teachers could develop in order to drive these interactions was social cue identification. And then we presented this at the Castle Exchange, and there were a group of kids in the audience, and they're like, no,
I was just
totally
thinking about
100%.
them.
They were like, you guys, I don't know where you're coming from or what you're doing, but you understand the thing, which doesn't seem to be obvious in terms of how many teachers understand what their job is to be paying attention to how students are engaging in the materials and themselves and each other so that they can provide a context for learning, right? And I just wanted to elevate that because I remember the kids and they were like, no, 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 you guys totally yes. I don't know what
Well,
you came
okay.
from.
Yes, I remember that, but I was thinking, Dave, of you in that context because, a part of what we wrote about in the book chapter and part of what you've helped me really see even more clearly is how the skills we have in ourselves as adults, the sort of social emotional skills that we have allow us to do that kind of acute detection. So if I walk into a classroom and I am feeling sad, depressed, worried, overwhelmed, I'm just gonna shut down and do the things that are sitting in front of me. And I was just thinking of you as a facilitator in that session that we did at Castle. You have those underlying skills that allowed you to actually see those students because they were kind of in the back of the room and recognize the opportunity that sat in us spending more time with them. And what I remember most about that is the other, 40 and 50-year-olds in the room, it changed the dynamic to be listening to them. So, I think it is in the moment, are you able to do that cue detection and responsiveness in ways that really transform the opportunity for everyone to learn?
Well, let's go back to 26-year-old Bridget because I promised you
Oh,
that I would
yeah.
not forget this, and I keep my word. I'm a man of my word. What were your thoughts on that? What did you wanna bring out?
Well, I mean, I think one of my big learnings over the past, I would say, decade or so. So, one of the things that happened about, I don't know, 2018, however long ago that was, is I left my full time job at the University of Virginia and came to work at Teachstone, which is the organization that we founded to really disseminate work around class. And a part of my coming back to Teachstone at the time was a recognition that, this was a measure that had been developed, 20 years ago, and there was work to be done. There were a lot of things that we've sort of changed as we've gone back to looking at class, but one of the more fundamental is all of us come and are a reflection of our own experiences. And so for me, as a 26-year-old white girl who grew up in Sacramento, California, in sort of a middle class background, I had a certain set of perceptions about what interactions look like,
Mm,
drove the words that were written in the class
mm,
manual. And so as we've done some of the revision work that we call class second edition, it's been about a recognition that we can actually describe these core elements of interaction, but do a much better job at talking about, demonstrating through video, how they look across a lot of different cultures and
mm,
contexts. We used to have one of the more depressing things to me was educators who said they were being evaluated by class and said, I have to be a different person when class comes in
mm.
because it has a set of expectations about what I should look like and how I should sound.
Mm.
Um, and so we've really done hard work to say, it's not about 26-year-old Bridget and some, other researchers' vision, but really about listening to educators and understanding how they express these same kinds of things that we've been talking about. So,
Well, let's just spend a little bit more time on this. You have a new edition that came out recently.
yeah, yeah.
What are some takeaways? Like, what are some things you learned over the last 20 years? How does this new edition reflect some of those learnings? And how was it demonstrated in some of the language that you guys use in class
Yeah.
2.0?
Yeah. Well, first reflection is change is hard. Right.
I was
So,
not happy. We're just like, "This is a big
yeah,
task." And I was like, "Yeah."
exactly. And this is one of the tensions, right? We've trained over 100,000 people and they're certified on class. We currently have 30,000 people. So like changing is always hard. However, there's a great Maya Angelou quote that's something about, you do as well as you can. And then when you know better, do better. And there was
Mm,
just a moment where we knew better. So I'll give you some examples that I think have been really powerful.
yeah.
There's indicator within what we call positive climate, which is really about the social and emotional sort of relationships in a classroom. And we used to talk about watching for positive affect,
Mhm,
for smiles, for laughter. And one of the things that we recognized is we weren't actually interested in smiles and laughter. We were interested in something that we've now termed enjoyment.
mhm,
Recognizing that enjoyment can look different in different contexts. So we have some great video as an example in our new training from some Native American Head Start program. And there's a teacher interacting with a few students. And I don't know that maybe there's like one smile in the moment, but it is so clear that that teacher and the students are enjoying each other. So it is about making sure we don't use words that make people look for the wrong things, right? In this case, words matter because we're training people, and sometimes this tool is used as an accountability tool. So we have to be
Yeah.
really careful about that.
I'm deeply resonant with that, Bridget, and I want to just commend you on this because we have to achieve a level of abstraction that captures the concept, but be specific enough that we can create reliability. And so the difference between enjoyment and, for example, positive affect and or like laughter and enjoyment, there's a different level of abstraction there. And so I can appreciate the challenge it takes to really refine your concept and construct in your mind in a way that allows people to interact with it, but also allows us to see it consistently in classrooms that are different and in different places.
Yeah, and I think you've hit at one of the biggest sort of challenges of doing this work. But one of the things that I think, frankly, we've gotten kind of right in class, which is sort of what's the grain size of what you measure. So people always, if they go through a class training, they want to make it a checklist because that seems easier to get right.
Yes.
But what we know is if we make it a checklist, we get rid of the ability for humans to sort of put together complicated sets of information into a bigger whole. So,
Yeah.
we've been talking about positive climate. That's a dimension. That's what a classroom gets scored on. But there's 4 indicators, and each of those indicators has behavior markers that you learned. So we have that grain size because you need it because you have to train people on what to look for, but we're not really scoring at that level.
Mhm.
So that's been important. But I will say one other insight that we've had of late,
Nice.
which is we used to think, so I used to think that the best observer was the most unbiased observer, meaning the person who knows the least about the
Mhm.
classroom that they're going in because they're not going to bring their preconceived notions about that classroom into their scores. And we've really sort of flipped that because we recognize that a part of this idea of going into a classroom and observing, it's really the more you understand about the culture and the context allows you to know
Mm.
what behavioral markers to look for that represent that core idea.
Wow.
So we say, we don't have all the behavioral markers there. You can have other behavioral markers that you recognize in your community, in your classrooms reflect this idea, and that's great. Now, the sort of academics and the people who want reliability are really
Yes.
challenged by that. But one of my favorite papers came out of work in Louisiana, and they actually showed that local ratings performed by folks who had a lot less sort of time to calibrate and make sure they were scoring accurately. Their observations in classrooms predicted student learning as well as our sort of UVA trained graduate students did.
Mhm.
And I think it's because even if they were technically less reliable in the sort of formal definition, they brought their experience and ideas into what to pay attention to. So it's a challenge to get right.
Well, I appreciate that challenge, and I also appreciate the effort that you continue to make to generalize while being specific. There is sometimes a trend to say there is no generalizable knowledge. There's nothing that matters across difference. I reject that. I disagree with that. I think that the point of science is to get the most generalizable concepts. And then, as you're saying, start to think about how do we refine these ideas into community to make meaning of them. So I just want to take a moment to appreciate that because it's an ongoing space that I know that we all struggle with. And I know you put a lot of effort into making that work. So let's go from here
Yeah.
into our innovations lightning round. So this is the time where we're going to spend some time educating me and hopefully other folks around what works and what's true in the educational research space. So
Oh, goodness.
we're going to do this with a true false format. I'm going to ask you a question and then you're going to tell me true or false and then educate me into why that's the case. How do you feel about that, Bridget?
Is there a right answer to these?
There is an answer. There is a righter and a wronger answer, but you
All
know
right.
what they are, and
All
we're gonna
right.
make this
Just trying to
work.
prepare myself.
All right. So the first true false answer we're gonna do is true false. The most consistent predictor of student performance is the quality of teaching. Bridget Hamre, true or false?
Oh, false. By far. I wish. My job would be a lot easier if the things that we measured predicted a huge amount of variance in student outcomes, but they don't, right? They predict a relatively small portion of the variance. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, we typically are observing for one day and then using that to predict outcomes for 30 students over the course of a year. But more importantly, there are far more fundamental things that impact students' learning and development than teaching. Most notably, lots of their outside of the school experiences, socioeconomic status, some of what they bring to the classroom with them, their early learning experiences are really fundamental in whether or not they can sort of fully take advantage of what's in the classroom to create better outcomes. So I appreciate you asked that because, you know, I wish that teachers had even more power. However, I will say, and I expect this is true for you as well, that we could be doing work in other spaces that ultimately potentially has more power to change things for students, things like work around poverty. But what's interesting and what keeps me excited about the educational space is it's a publicly funded system.
Mm.
And that means we have better levers for change. And so I try in my work to keep focused on that portion of students' outcomes that we can impact and help teachers see that and also help them recognize that they can't do it all.
I appreciate that, Bridget. Is there any insight into like how much is school-based, teacher-based? How much is outside-based?
I don't know. I feel like, do you have a number? I don't know that I have a number top of my head.
I mean, I don't have a number top of my head. I know the estimates in terms of teacher kind of contributions to student outcomes around 30% in terms of what we can attribute directly to teaching. And then some of those other variables that you talked about in terms of poverty, maternal education level, and those really do drive predictions of student performance, right?
Yeah.
So I do wish, and I do take solace though, because I know you and I share this belief that we're going to maximize what we can do. And we're not going to be like, oh, but, because that 30% is still 30%. And that's something that we can affect.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so let's move on to our next lightning round. Here we go. True, false. A state recently removed professional development, an unnamed state, on social and emotional learning because it didn't, quote, address core academic issues such as teaching reading, science, and math, end quote. Is this statement on SEL true or false, Dr. Bridget Hamre? Over to you.
False. I mean, we know that's false for all the reasons that we've already talked about. You know, if it were only so easy to have students learn those outcomes as like putting them through the right content, then, we'd all have quit long ago. That stuff is the easy stuff to get. So yeah, I don't know what more to say about that because I feel like we've talked about it a lot, except that, I think the folks who are leading the charge in articulating the ways in which social emotional learning is important are going to win at the end of the day. Maybe one other piece I would just say about it is I think sometimes we get in our own way because those of us who talk about things like social emotional learning sometimes can make it sound like something that's different so that teachers have to use an SEL curricula if they want these outcomes, et cetera. And you don't think about it this way. I always love listening to you. I think the more we can do to help educators, leaders see that these aren't different skills, they are skills that are occurring all of the time. And
Mm.
we are doing a disadvantage to our teachers if we don't empower them with knowing how to best support those skills in the context of daily instruction.
Dr. Bridget Hamre, it is false. It is false. Social emotional skills matter for content understanding.
Kind
All
of
right,
right.
question
Right.
3. True, false.
Yes.
Instructional feedback must be content specific to positively impact student learning. Dr. Bridget Hamre, true or false?
False. I have some great evidence about this. One of the studies that was done around class was done with our coaching model, which is called My Teaching Partner. I can tout this research because it isn't mine. Joseph Allen and Bob Pianta and Ann Gregory and lots of other amazing people did this research. I was actually published in Science, which is always like, I don't have any papers in science, so someday maybe. But what we did is we coached teachers around their interactions. And teachers in this initial study were either social studies, they were all middle and high school. They were either social studies, math, English language arts, or science. And our two coaches for that studies, one was a Spanish instructor and one was an ELA instructor. They didn't know, they were not experts in math.
Mhm,
They were experts in interactions. And
mhm.
they coached these teachers across content area on these interactions in ways that positively changed interactions as measured by class, but more importantly, changed standardized test scores across all 4 domains. So to me, that was pretty solid evidence that, again, content matters. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have folks know content, but absolutely instruction does not have to be content focused to be able to ensure students learn.
False on instructional feedback must be content specific. All right, we have two more opportunities here
Right.
to educate ourselves with regards to educational research. Next question, true, false. Emotional support is more important to younger kids than to older kids in terms of instructional outcomes. This seems obviously true, Bridget. I mean, younger kids, they need to be held and loved on. We don't care about high school students.
No, I mean, again, I have a 17-year-old son, and if you ask him, and I do, poor kid, about this, those things matter more, right? Because having a teacher who actually demonstrates that they care about you,
Mm.
that they believe in you, that they see that you can achieve something great, like that is that's like food to any adolescent. So, no, I think emotional support just gets more important over time, but it makes more sense to early childhood educators. So it's easier to sell
Makes
emotional
more sense.
support in the early childhood world. Most superintendents, like I said, the State Department didn't want to talk about emotion, so it doesn't feel comfortable.
But you and I sat with those kids and we spent a lot of time in classrooms and we know regard for adolescent perspectives does matter. So
Yep.
unfortunately, we're at one more false. All right. We have one last true false. And I think in this space, I want to make sure that we have at least one true. And I'm pretty confident about this. So and let me just put this out. True false, Dr. Bridget Hamre, tailoring instruction to students' preferred learning style,
I
visual,
know.
auditory, or kinesthetic will optimize learning outcomes. I did not hear this in the class. So I want to give you an opportunity to validate learning styles in our true false lightning round. Dr. Bridget Hamre, true false.
I'm just going to say false, and then I'm going to point people to anything Dan Willingham has written on this subject because he literally has tried to take this on because it just does not go away. But absolutely, there is no evidence that that is true.
All right. So that concludes our lightning round. We had all falses on this, Bridget. And so you had an opportunity to kind of debunk some myths. We spent 10 years compiling what matters. And yet we're still kind of focused on some things that may not matter. How do we explain that in the educational space from your perspective?
So, if only it were as simple as like doing research. What I would say is this it's the reason why I left my job at the University of Virginia and came to Teachstone because there's always a need for more research. But what we need is more examples of how to make research relevant in ways that it shows up in classrooms every day. And at our best, I think that's what we do with class because we've tried to sort of take decades of research from child development, from education, and sort of put it into the tool, but then put that tool into the hands of incredible leaders like yourself and let them bring that science into the classroom. And that's a really complicated theory of change. So it's not like we can just write a bunch of articles and expect that teachers are going to suddenly change what they do. So I think maybe the answer is we need some work on the theory of change around how to bring research into practice in ways that are probably ultimately going to lead to some fundamental shifts in how we learn about what works in classrooms.
I'm hearing this as interactions matter with research. And the question of how we drive that research and drive interactions that can penetrate practice is something that's worthy of its own study.
Yeah. I will just share one other quick thing, which is most teachers are not trained to appreciate research, right? So I don't know what your background was. Mine was in psychology. I had to
Psychology.
participate in research as an undergraduate psychology student. We don't typically do that with our education students. So I also think there's a path toward making sure that we're doing more to socialize the education field to the power of research.
I'm going to jump on to the next question, but I'm really resonant with that, Bridget. Content matters less than the interactions that drive it. And as I was developing educational psychology, we know it's interactions based. So I'm resonant with that. And we're thinking about how do we organize our teacher education space to be less content focused as content becomes less relevant because of AI, which brings me to our next topic, right?
So
Because
the topic of the
we
day.
we talk about AI here on the show. You and I talk about AI. It may be that all of this conversation about interactions does not matter because our AI overlords will come and teach us everything we need to know through little things that go into the back of our brain vis-a-vis the Matrix, right? I mean, Keanu Reeves, am I hitting
Yeah.
you in the right place here?
I know, and I used to think I'd be dead by then, but now it's, like, happening pretty quick, so I think I
Congratulations,
need
Bridget.
to pay
You
attention.
made it.
You know what? I read this great op-ed in the New York Times, I think it was last week, about how we're shifting from a knowledge economy to a relationist economy. I am buying this agreement or this idea about the impact, which means actually, I think everything that we've been talking about will matter more because computers are going to get smarter. Machines are going to get smarter at teaching students to read. I just think that's a reality because I mean, imagine the typical kindergarten, first grade teacher with 25 students at all different levels. The science of reading is complicated and hard. We're going to get much better about using technology to give each student what they need to learn the skills. But all the stuff we've been talking about, relationships, communication, thinking skills, I think that it's going to be a little while until machines can do that.
Let's spend a little bit more time on this. We are investing in an AI tool here at the Urban Assembly, which is focused on teacher feedback, actually incorporating some concepts and constructs into class.
Yeah.
And one of the questions our teachers ask is like, David, are you trying to drive me out of a job? And this notion of the kinds of interactions that matter for teachers about building trust, about creating learning experiences, those are things I believe in. There's a scene from Star Trek. I don't know if I ever told you this, Bridget. It's Spock, Star Trek One, and he's sitting in a pod, and there's this like machine asking him questions, and he's responding because he's super smart because he's Vulcan. And this was supposed to be like the future of education. And I remember this because I like Star Trek. And in Star Trek, there are photon torpedoes and there's warp speed. All these things I'm totally down with. Aliens from distant galaxies. But I watched this scene and I was like, I don't really buy this. I'm pulled out of the moment because that would not be an advanced version of education, sitting a child in a pod by themselves answering questions when you have like an artificial intelligence who can do that for you. And it's not really how teaching and learning works.
Well, I mean, I think a more fundamental question is if education is going to stay the sort of birth to 12 education system, which is what we focus on, is going to stay focused on creating the outcomes we need for people to be successful in life. The fundamental
Thriving.
question is like, what is that going to look like?
Mhm.
Right. And the knowledge economy required us to bring a lot of knowledge to be able to be successful. I expect that's going to shift. And maybe that will fundamentally break us out of the paradigm that we've been in around what education needs to look like so that we could recenter around relationships and interactions. And I might just say, I haven't thought of a better word, but maybe teachers do need to go the way of the dinosaur because they're
Yeah.
teachers, right? It comes back to this idea of what if, what could humans, adults who care about kids, do in classrooms if they didn't have to be responsible for teaching them the 50,000 pieces of skill that they need, but could truly be there to help kids thrive? So I don't know what the word is, but I feel like we might need another word.
I'm resonant with it. I think we are underestimating the power of what AI will do to even the very concept of what it means to be a publicly educated, right? And I'm inspired by the notion of what we talk about thriving, right? Helping young people take their place in our society. And that means thinking, knowing, being, and all the good stuff that we talk about when we talk about a whole person. All right. So now that we've talked about your past 15, 20 years. Now that we've talked about what the future will be in terms of AI, now that we've talked about the class and how you revised it, and what it means to thrive, where's your vision, Bridget, for the next 5 years of education? Where are your things that you're proud of? Where are things that you're excited about? Where will your philosophies, inspirations be taking us in the future of the education?
Well, I would say I am most excited and inspired by you, Dave, and by people like you around the country. So I actually am most excited about being able to be just like a spark of innovation that helps empower incredible teachers, leaders, policymakers to really do something different. And so, we have a great opportunity every year to get together with folks at this conference we call Interact, being in that space and watching how many people are really pushing around some of these innovative ideas. And what you keep saying also, it comes back to interaction. So getting somebody like you, Dave, who thinks about this deeply in New York City, together with somebody who's thinking about it in preschools in Mississippi, like you could feel like you guys do totally different things. But at the end of the day, you don't. And the power of bringing folks like that together is, something that I'm really focused on right now and excited about.
Well, Bridget, I want to say thank you for coming on to my podcast today. Your work certainly inspires me. You're one of my favorite people to talk to. You're one of my favorite people to connect with in terms of how you think about the work. And if interactions matter, then these are some of my favorite interactions when we think about the future of teaching and learning. So on behalf of the Urban Assembly, thank you for your time here today.
Thank you. It's also, one of the best things to come out of COVID for me, because that's when we met, is on
I was having this conversation with myself.
billion webinars
What was the time?
we all had in the spring of 2020, and we met and something just clicked. And yeah, it's been great. So thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams, and have a great day.